Hello everyone, and welcome to a new What If video. In this installment, we're going to be focusing on Illidan's Storm Rage, and specifically, what if Illidan had become a druid like his brother Malfurion? Well, let's talk about that today. Sit back, relax, and prepare for a very tragic story. With Cenarius' blessing, both Malfurion and Illidan's Storm Rage become the first druids of Azeroth and take great pride in their accomplishments. Malfurion is pleased, Tyrande is overjoyed for them both, but Illidan ponders on the future, wondering what sort of destiny he has ahead of him. Since the first time he was told that his eyes meant he had a great future, Illidan had struggled to find his destiny, but with his successful passing of Cenarius' trials, he felt that he had finally found the right path to walk on. Cenarius would praise the two brothers as, despite being different, they would represent two sides of Druidism. On one hand, Malfurion would be the more patient, meditative, and teaching side of the Druidic path. But Illidan stood for the power of Druidism, of nature, and how it could be unleashed upon the enemies who would seek to defile the forest. In this particular scenario, Cenarius, I believe, would have spent many hours with Illidan alone, teaching him the ways of the bear spirit, of the power of strength in body and in mind. Illidan would, in this respect, have been the very first Druid of the Claw, and Malfurion would have been the first Druid of the Wild, exploring all avenues rather than just mastering one. However, their success in Druidism was short-lived, as the War of the Ancients would begin, started by the Highborn and their reckless use of arcane magic. Rather than dividing themselves like in the original story, however, Illidan, Malfurion, and Tyrande, along with the allied forces of nature, the dragons, and so forth, they would be able to defeat the Legion in a somewhat similar scenario to the original lore. I'd spend more time discussing all the details of this particular event, but I really want to focus more on what happens after the war is over, so let's just move on to that. After the War of the Ancients is over, the world finds itself sundered, and the former glory days of the Night Elves are over, and the remaining elves are looking to the future with a lot of doubt in their hearts. The Second Well of Eternity wouldn't exist, but Nordrassil still would have been planted, and the Dragon Aspect's gifts would have been given to the Night Elves. And so we enter into the more difficult years of the Night Elves' history. Their culture has collapsed, their cities have been destroyed, and where their culture once heavily depended on arcane magic for everything from building, to cleaning water, to growing food, now they have to make do without it. Without any true leaders thanks to the betrayal of Queen Azshara, Malfurion, Stormrage, and Illidan take up the mantle, with Tyrande leading the Sisterhood of Elune beside them. People would see Malfurion and Illidan as heroes due to the events of the war, but Malfurion in particular would have been held a little higher, as it was his plans that ultimately defeated the Legion. Now what makes matters worse is despite his fighting in the war, Illidan soon discovers that Tyrande has chosen his brother over him in regards to being her partner. While Illidan had been just as great of a warrior and had aided his brother on all of his trials and plans during the conflict, people would primarily see him as the hero, and he would enjoy the spoils of the war's end in the form of Tyrande, the woman that Illidan loves. As you can imagine, jealousy and a bit of anger would set into Illidan pretty fast. The Night Elves would begin to focus on rebuilding their society under the gaze of the Stormrage brothers and Tyrande. Homes would be built, farms would be planted, and the pieces of the war would be picked up. Due to the hardships of the time, however, some people would begin to doubt if this more nature-based culture would be capable of defending itself if the Legion returned again. Sure, they admitted that Druidism was powerful, but magic was the lifeblood of their people, and for it to be banned so immediately by the Stormrage brothers, it was ridiculous. These sorts of people, those who shared Illidan's point of view in the original lore, would probably begin to practice magic in secret and would try to recover as much knowledge of the arcane from the remnants of the former Night Elf civilization. During this time, fear and superstition would plague the remaining Night Elves. Demons still lingered in Azeroth. Many elves feared the deeper forests of Kalimdor because of their former city-living lifestyles. and the future was completely uncertain for their people if the demons returned to Azeroth. Fear would turn to anger, and arguments would break out amongst the survivors despite their need to work together. Common folk would blame the former spellcasters and the surviving Highborn that had nothing to do with Queen Azshara's betrayal for the war and for the destruction of their past lives. Fights would sometimes break out, and it wasn't uncommon for a former mage to return to his little makeshift home to find it in ruin, with the windows broken and with what goods he had stolen. Having no true experience with leadership, the Stormrage brothers would ignore this issue for a time, perhaps even feeling a bit of anger towards the arcane users as well, but everything would change when words turned into physical violence. One day, during a gathering of the people, a series of bodies would be dragged forward, a man and his wife, both former Highborn and Zinashari, both former spellcasters, and both now dead, having been stoned to death by an enraged trio of men who now stood before the Stormrage brothers in shackles. The former spellcasters and the Highborn would demand justice for the murders, but some of the common folk would shout that they deserved to die, as their magic was what attracted the Burning Legion in the first place. As tensions would rise, Malfurion would find words stuck in his throat. Illidan, however, would stand, seeing his brother choked by the enraged situation. With a great roar, he would silence the crowd, and Illidan would speak, telling the people that although the Highborn and the arcane users did bring the Legion into their world, not all of them were to blame. In a quick showing of leadership, Illidan would demand the heads of all three of the murderers, and they would be publicly killed and put up as a warning for anyone who would try to threaten the stability of their rebuilding culture. Because of his actions, the former arcane users would be happy with Illidan, but the majority of the folk, the common people, would see him as a sympathizer with their enemies. Malfurion would commend his brother on his actions, but he would also propose to him an idea. The allure of magic was very strong in their people, and thus Malfurion felt that a good idea might be to offer them Druidism as a form of study. Both he and Illidan would become the teachers of this new Druidic group, which would be called the Cenarian Circle, named after Cenarius himself. Illidan would agree that the idea was a good one, and thus the brothers would begin to teach anyone who was willing to learn and had the discipline for it, Druidism. It wouldn't be easy at first, but slowly, Illidan and Malfurion would adapt into their new roles as Shandos together. However, even with their combined efforts, suppressing the memories of lost loved ones would prove an impossible task, and with the blessing of immortality, the Stormrage brothers knew one hard truth: these people would never forget. For a time, there would be a brief calm after the executions and the opening of Druidic teachings to the folk. However, soon the people who were not studying under the brothers and still lingered in the past would rise up against the arcane users. Former Highborn and spellcasters would go missing in the night, children would disappear, and books and diaries that former arcane users kept would be burned out of paranoia. Ultimately, the mob would rise again, only this time the spellcasters would strike back. Unknown to Malfurion and Illidan, many former arcane users again would have been practicing the arcane arts in secret, having disagreed with the brothers' ban on magic. When at last the mob would come for them, spells of fire and frost and arcane would burn away the flesh of the commoners, and a great fight would break out. Homes would be burnt down, many would die, and the brothers would be forced to summon the Druids to calm the situation. Some of the Druids, however, they would discover, sided with the common people and would use their magic against the arcane users to kill them, while some would agree with the prospect of bringing peace to the situation. After an evening of violence and death, the dust would settle in the morning, and a line in the sand would have to be drawn. Illidan would propose banishing the spellcasters from the Night Elf lands forever for their past sins, but Malfurion and Tyrande would propose possibly offering them a second chance, seeing as how their people really needed one another if they wanted to survive. Illidan would say that that was insane, it was madness, and he would demand that Malfurion look at how terrible the situation had become. Reluctantly, Malfurion would agree, and the former Highborn and spell users would be banished from their society as traitors. Upon doing so, Illidan would also create a new sect of druids, the Guardians, who would protect their people from spell users if they ever returned. The druids who sided against the Highborn rallied under Illidan's aggressive ideas for defense, and Malfurion would retreat into the nearby forests to meditate and to seek guidance from Cenarius. Some time would pass, but ultimately an incident would occur where a former spellcaster would happen upon a Night Elf settlement only to be captured by Illidan's guardian druids before being brought to him. With an iron fist, Illidan would declare that the Night Elves and those who use the arcane share no kinship, and that in order to ensure the security of their people, the captured prisoner must die as a warning to the others of his kind to stay away. Malfurion would protest, but Illidan would say that this was the only way to ensure their people would be safe from the corrupting influence of magic. This time, however, Malfurion would not be so easily bent to his brother's will, and he would rise up and protect the captured prisoner, seeing as he committed no crime other than accidentally traveling into their area. Illidan and his guardian druids would be really disturbed by this empathy towards their enemies, but they would bite their tongues for a time, as Malfurion and his balanced druids would release the man and send him back to his people with a warning on his lips. This is when the Cenarian Circle would begin to split in its ideology. On one hand, Malfurion treated the Cenarian Circle as a sort of beacon of hope for their people, but Illidan saw it as the Night Elves' first line of defense against anything that would threaten their existence, even their own kind. While Malfurion used Druidism as a means of teaching meditation, discipline, and finding enlightenment, Illidan began to use his guardian druids as a sort of police force among their people, sniffing out anybody who may harbor any interest in the arcane or were practicing it in secret, only to arrest them and have them exiled or killed depending on the level of the crime. Illidan and Malfurion would often come to blows over these issues, but their fight would be put on pause as the War of the Satyr would break out. Again, demons would descend upon the Night Elves, and the Druids would be forced to rise up to the defense of their people. This time, however, they would find themselves betrayed from within, as Druids, many of whom were Malfurion's students, found themselves doubting in their ability to defeat the Legion and began to turn to the pack form, becoming the first Worgen. As the war raged on, Illidan's guardian druids would bear the bulk of the fighting, with Malfurion's students acting more as healers and medicine men. Ultimately, Malfurion would use the Scythe of Elune, and the Worgen would be banished away. Shortly after the war's ending, Illidan would be quick to point out the weakness of Malfurion's approach to Druidism. Where Illidan's guardian druids stood against the demons with a will of iron, Malfurion's students doubted and feared, and many of them turned to the pack form and became Worgen. With so many now trapped in the dream, Illidan's students vastly outnumbered Malfurion's, leading Illidan to become somewhat of the true leader of the Cenarian Circle, with his brother operating behind his back, doing his best to keep what he called the spirit of Druidism alive with his few students. Illidan would let his brother continue his teachings for a time, but something would happen that would change the relationship of the brothers for good. Tyrande would give birth to a son. When this happens, the jealousy and the annoyance that Illidan had towards his brother would overflow, and he would be quick to tell Malfurion at a public Cenarian gathering that he should step down as a leader and leave the governance of their people to him. "Go and be with your family," he would tell his brother. "I shall guide and protect our people, me and my druids." Malfurion, however, would disagree and would begin to openly criticize his brother and his more police state approach to Druidism. Malfurion would point out the times that Illidan's guardian druids had arrested men and women who had committed no crime other than carrying a small arcane relic of the past, and then had banished them, only to have their bodies found weeks later in the forest, having died of starvation. Malfurion would also criticize Illidan's lust for power and his bold-headedness that he felt was a threat to what Cenarius taught them in the first place. Malfurion's remaining students would stand behind him, but the other 80% of the druids in the moot would shout them down, standing up for their Shondo Illidan and his approach to druidism. They would call Malfurion and his students weak, and they would say that although Malfurion did great things during the War of the Ancients, he was no true leader and he could not take the Night Elves into the future and fully rebuild their civilization. As tensions would continue to rise in the Druidic moot, a spell would be slung, striking one of Malfurion's students, and violence would break out at the gathering. Names would be shouted, insults thrown, and Illidan's guardians would call for an exile of Malfurion and his druids, saying that they sympathized with the spellcasters and that their way would damn their people if the Legion returned, pointing to the War of the Satyr as evidence. Malfurion would also point out that Illidan's aggressive approach had led to many common people turning against him. Ever since the first execution of the 3 murderers, and since the forming of Illidan's Guardian Druid search force, common folk were afraid of him, as well as his druids. People feared for the trinkets that they held onto from the past. They feared what they'd write into books would open them up to superstition. And most of all, they feared that Illidan and his druids had grown so powerful since the War of the Satyr that he would soon rule over the remaining Night Elves as a sort of self-proclaimed dictator. At this, Illidan's supporters would shout down Malfurion, and Illidan himself would speak up, claiming that if such a thing was necessary towards the survival of the Night Elves, as well as to protect them from the arcane and ensure that the Legion would never return to Azeroth, he would become anything that was demanded of him, even the dictator that Malfurion claimed that he was turning into. And then, over the raised voices, Malfurion would speak to Illidan and tell him a hard truth. He would say, "Look at what you've created. Look at the hate in your druid's eyes. This is not what druidism is, and this is not what Cenarius taught us to be before the war. You shame him, and you shame yourself with your appeals to power. This is why Tyrande never loved you, because she saw you always as the beast that you are." And with that, consumed in rage, Illidan would attack his brother in his bear form, roaring loudly. The two would fight at the center of the moot, all the druids watching, and despite his best efforts, Malfurion just wouldn't be able to best his brother, who had spent all these years fighting, training, and becoming stronger. Without even thinking, Illidan would bite down into his brother's neck, only to suddenly realize what he had done. Shifting out of his bear form quickly, he would look down, and he would watch as his brother would bleed to death from the terrible wound that Illidan had inflicted. With his final breath, Malfurion would call out for Tyrande and his son, before dying at the center of the gathered druids, all of which would sit in silence, realizing just how far they had fallen from what Cenarius had originally taught. And in that moment, as Illidan would look down at the dead body of his brother, Illidan would realize another hard truth. His brother was right about him and what he had let himself become. Alright guys, and that is it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you would like to hear more what-if scenarios from the lore, feel free to suggest them in the comments below, as I am always open to suggestions. Thank you guys for watching though, and I will see you guys next time.